China is a bit of a fair weather friend when it comes to these governments we often put together. If you look at what happened during the 12-day war last June in 2025, we should say now, China actually did very little when the US and Israel were attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. And that's because China wants to have this kind of discounted oil or whatever advantages it can take from these pariah regimes without actually having to expend any of its own resources in propping them up.
Welcome back. It's Ed Vaizes, still with my excellent columnists Cindy Yu and Michael Binion. Now let's talk about what is going on in Iran. US President Donald Trump has said he's locked and loaded, ready to intervene in Iran if peaceful protesters are shot by the security services. Protests have swept the country in recent days, with Tehran placed into shutdown on Wednesday, the regime claiming that was due to cold weather. Now, Michael Binion, I think this is a really important story, but obviously none of us can work out whether these protests are going to be successful or clamped down brutally. But the Iranian regime is on its knees. It lost its war against Israel. It's been severely depleted, and it does seem that different elements of Iranian society are sort of coming together as one because of the sheer economic despair in the country, as well as obviously the brutality. How are you viewing what is going on in Iran?
Well, with a lot of interest. In fact, we had a leader all about it, which actually I wrote yesterday or a couple of days ago. And the point is that there's a huge power struggle going on within Iran behind all this. It's a struggle to succeed Ayatollah Khamenei, who is old and ailing, and people think that he's trying to push his son into taking over. The Revolutionary Guard are determined to keep their influence and their privileges and their corrupt access to vast wealth inside Iran, which they get, against the backdrop of the determination to keep the Islamist government system going, whereas most people are fed up with it. Most people resent the restrictions, want to change, want proper free elections, and behind all that, you've got this sort of whole struggle playing out over Iran's world role, whether they should be activists and intervene in kind of revolutionary movements overseas. We saw the failure of Hezbollah and of the other areas they've tried to sort of promote their interests. So altogether, it's a huge struggle, but it's day-to-day stuff that's triggering it. High prices, inflation, drought, which is hurting the farmers, and general feeling that the country is just on its knees. Inflation almost double. It's 1.4 million Iranian rials to the dollar. That, what sort of currency is that?
Who will prevail, though, Michael?
I'm afraid the government will crack down as ruthlessly as it needs to, as it has in the past. The protests over the hijab a couple of years ago, they went on for more than a year, but in the end, the ringleaders were arrested or silenced or executed, and it sort of fizzled out. We had huge riots and over the election some time ago of Ahmadinejad. It was thought to be an unfair election. They were crushed. Everything that needs to be done to stop any challenge to the system will be done.
And of course, Cindy, Iran, the future of the regime in Iran matters to certain countries. It matters to Russia. And indeed, it matters to China. China gets some of its oil from Iran, and its influence in the region is bolstered by being close to the current Iranian regime. How do you think the different powers, we've heard what President Donald Trump says he's going to do, how do you think it will play out in geopolitical terms?
Yes, it's true that China and Iran have this trading relationship on oil. In 2021, there was an investment deal that the two countries signed, which I think many Iranians hoped would be some kind of economic turning point for the hopes of the country. But actually, China is a bit of a fair weather friend when it comes to these governments we often put together. If you look at what happened during the 12-day war last June in 2025, we should say now, China actually did very little when the US and Israel were attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. And that's because China wants to have this kind of discounted oil or whatever advantages it can take from these pariah regimes without actually having to expend any of its own resources in propping them up. And similarly, we've seen that when it comes to Venezuela. Just before Christmas, the Venezuelan foreign minister had a call with the Chinese foreign minister to get some kind of help with Trump's circling off the country. And the Chinese basically gave a very kind of meek statement about how they support sovereignty, but didn't really do anything else. So I think Iran, if the Ayatollahs think they can rely on China, I don't think they do, but they would be right to not think that they do. They can. And I think China is just kind of waiting to see what happens, basically. But this kind of, this kind of protest does trigger certain instincts in China, because look at what's happening here. We have economic pressures leading to normal business people going onto the streets. We have the students who are more ideological joining with them. What does that remind you of? Tiananmen Square in 1989. So I think China will be watching very closely to make sure that nothing is replicated within China by students who think that actually that they're inspired by what's going on.
Yes, I mean, but the economic situation in China is nowhere near as dire as it is in Iran. In fact, it's not dire at all in some respects.
No, not at all. I mean, it's perfectly. I mean, it's much slower. Economic growth is much slower than it used to be 10, 15 years ago, where it was 10% each year. Now it's about somewhere between 3 and 5%. At the same time, there is not a massive inflation problem. If anything, they have deflation problem, which has its own consequences, but it does mean that daily life is affordable. Youth unemployment is a problem, but that's still a minority of people. The housing crisis is a problem, but it's a slow motion crash. So all of these things, none of it has come into a head in a way that Iran has done in the last few months. So I think those economic incentives are not there for protest, but you never know. And I think authoritarian regimes are particularly sensitive because they are.
No, that is really fascinating.
U.S. President Donald Trump wrote on social media on Friday that, quote, if Iran shots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue. A top Iranian official responded to Trump's comments, warning that U.S. interference in domestic Iranian issues would equal the destabilization of the whole region. The U.S. warning comes days into unrest that has left several dead and posed the biggest internal threat to Iranian authorities in years. Eyewitness video from Thursday showed an overturned car and several fires as protesters chanted outside a police station in Loristan province. This week's protests over soaring inflation have spread across Iran, with deadly confrontations between demonstrators and security forces. The elected president Masoud Pezeshkian has struck a conciliatory tone. On Thursday, he said the government was at fault for the conditions that gave rise to the demonstrations. State-affiliated media and rights groups have reported at least 6 deaths since Wednesday. Iran has seen repeated bouts of major unrest in recent decades, often quelling protests with heavy security measures and mass arrests. But worsening economic problems may leave authorities more vulnerable now. Pezeshkian's government is attempting a program of economic liberalization, but one step, deregulating some currency exchange, has contributed to a sharp decline in the value of Iran's rial on the unofficial market. That has compounded inflation, which has hovered above 36% since March, in an economy battered by Western sanctions.